think it's not a surprise to anyone who's subscribed to this channel to hear that Getter Robo is my second favorite manga of all time. I didn't make a massive 2.5-hour retrospective on Ken Ishikawa for nothing after all. And back when I uploaded that monster in April, I left off by saying this. Even if this adaptation ends up cutting off at the cliffhanger of the manga, I'll still be happy. I do really hope that this is the way we get to see the conclusion to Ishikawa's story. But even if it's not, this is a brand new Getter Robo anime in 2021. That's insane to me. This is such a massive year for Getter Robo, and it's a fitting coincidence that all this got announced while I was working on this video. Even if the mechs in the show are primarily CG, they look pretty spectacular, and have shown clear improvements in the most recent preview compared to the original trailer. I trust Jun Kawagoe and B Media to knock it out of the park. And now that Getter Robo Arc is a real show that just finished airing in late September 2021, being without question my most anticipated anime of the last 5 years, how did it turn out? My actual thoughts on the show are far more dense than I could have initially expected them to be. But to get something quick out of the way first, am I disappointed in Getter Robo Arc? No. Did it turn out to be ideally what I wanted in an adaptation? Hell no. But what we were given is a show that had very little chance of existing if it didn't turn out the way it did. I'd say the statement that sums up my feelings on the show best is that it's messy, but very passionate. The show ended up being a bit more divisive than I think anybody expected it to be, and this is for many reasons. Going off the initial trailers, we were hit with janky but steadily improving CGI models, as well as some solid still shots of the characters with exceptionally manga-accurate designs. Then we got to see footage of the 2D in motion, and well, that's where the depth of this review really starts. Now first off, I want to preface by saying that I do like Getter Robo Arc. Hell, I like it a lot. I even outright love aspects of it. I think this is a good show, and that's putting my inherent massive Getter bias aside. That said though, I would never call this production a great show. And that stings a bit because Jun Kawagoe has had a fantastic career as a director, from the 3 previous Getter OVAs, to the fantastic 2001 Cyborg 009 adaptation, and much, much more. But backing up a bit, I don't think there's any one individual to blame for this show's shortcomings. Because what this show gets right, it gets very right. It just has massive, impossible to ignore holes all throughout the production that hold it back from hitting the same strides as the previous Kawagoe OVAs and the manga it's adapting. But I feel I'm being slightly unfair, as this was a 13-episode TV anime on a TV schedule, and not an OVA with a month or longer break in between episodes. And in that regard, on the power ranking of Getter TV anime, Arc certainly sits at the top of the mountain for me. And you should already know how much I enjoy Toei's Getter series in spite of all of their flaws. But this is the first time an actual segment of Getter Robo's manga has been adapted directly from the pages of Ishikawa's magnum opus. So of course, on a narrative and character level, it curb stomps the previous TV anime. That said, I can't talk about what I liked and even loved in this show without addressing its obvious issues. I'm going to split this video into 2 segments. The first chunk right now will review the show and go over its strengths and shortcomings spoiler-free. The second segment will be a discussion on the series finale as well as the other massive additional narrative elements that weren't in the original manga. Getter Robo Arc for its entire run follows the manga story rather beat for beat, with a handful of changes and a ton of expanded scenes. Knowing that Arc's manga was cut short, of course, I expected some moments to be extended, and the way this is handled in the anime is actually pretty damn good, with a couple exceptions. From a story perspective, Getter Robo Arc feels like it added a missing 4th volume to the manga, as some moments that were way too brief in the manga are given time to breathe here. Writer Tadashi Hayakawa certainly deserves more than his fair share of applause for taking Arc's existing scenes and lengthening them in a natural way, all while keeping the fast, frantic pace that Getter is known for. Though with the anime having to flow through 13 episodes in a natural way, as well as integrating more of Getter Robo Go and Shin Getter Robo to cover certain flashbacks, some segments had to be cut. For example, the battle against the parasitic Bug Queen that originally took place in a small town has now been moved to take place inside of the Sao Tome Institute instead. Changes like this I'm perfectly fine with, as this adaptation needed to do this. It felt natural here, and despite how much I enjoy that segment in the village from the manga, it would have felt out of place coming off the heels of parts of Shin Getter. That said, I do have some problems in how the extended content was handled in places. For example, and this ties back to the show's biggest issue, which I'll talk about in a bit, flashbacks in the first few episodes get repeated wholesale a few times. Moments we've already seen are shown again with very little added, and it makes a few of the early episodes in this show feel strangely padded at times, which is definitely an odd fit for Getter, as it's a series practically built on its frantic pace. Aside from these occasional hiccups in the early episodes though, the script here is very strong, taking the manga almost word for word and packing in new material that fits in very well. From a deeper exploration of the culture of the Dinosaur Empire, including a look into the lives of the 3 Gettersaurus pilots, Vice, Ganryu, and Gozoro, a trio that weren't really even characters in the manga, but here they've been fleshed out into full-on side characters. And Getter Robo Arc's additions don't even stop there. More of a focus is put on the evil American scientist McDonald, and the most welcome change is the direct integration of Getter Robo Go characters who would certainly have been around during the events of Arc. It's great to see all of these faces again aged up a bit, and it serves the purpose of tying Arc's narrative even closer to Go and Shin quite well. Even taking more time to explore the state of the world after the catastrophic events of Go. Something the manga only touched on briefly. Also, seeing Sho Tachibana animated again, even with her changed hair color, is oh my god. The Musashi Stare lives! Sho carries the torch! We won! This was done for me! I don't care if it wasn't actually done for me. This was done for me! Thank you, Kawagoe! Anyway, as I said, the series does a lot to flesh out the elements of the manga that were simply passed over. But the most noteworthy and strongest change in this adaptation is the character of Baku Yamagishi. Both Takuma and Kamui are exceptionally accurate to the manga, so everything I said about these two in my original Getter retrospective still applies here. But Baku has been given a significantly bigger role in the narrative of the anime, and I'm all the more happy for it. Baku has gone from a character who can maybe represent a sort of balance or guiding light between Takuma and Kamui, to being just that. He serves as the perfect final piece of the trio, being a reasonable, down-to-earth, quick-witted tank, as opposed to the soft-spoken big man he was in the manga. He's also genuinely hilarious here too, more so than in the manga. And his role in the series finale, which I'll save for the second segment of this video, is just so good and does exactly what I wanted out of his character. This version of Baku was given just the right amount of time to breathe and find his place as a character, and I can now safely hold him on the same level as Takuma and Kamui. My boy is fleshed out and it's fantastic to see. Another strong aspect of the series is its immaculate voice cast. Returning faces such as almost the entire cast of Shin vs. Neo reprise their roles here, and continue to kill it just as much as they did in that OVA. But the real stars of the show here are the main Getter team as always. Yuma Uchida brings his A-game to the role of Takuma, giving what I consider to be the best vocal performance of 2021. His work here is as guttural and aggressive as you could want Takuma's voice to be. And those attack yells? Well, they certainly match Hideo Ishikawa's work as Ryoma. This performance blew me away more than I expected, and I have to be thankful for the fact that this franchise always manages to pull in the ideal voice cast for these characters. Arimaru Mukaino gives it his all for his debut role as Kamui, hitting just the right mix of soft and serious delivery that fits Kamui's contrasting personality perfectly. I'm really impressed by this performance. It's his first and he absolutely nailed it, giving Kamui the voice I always pictured him having. Kazuhiro Senseki also nails Baku. Sounding brutish and wise at the same time, he knocks that monk who can bench press you energy out of the park. Daisuke Ono is also here as Schweizer from Getter Go, which is just hilarious casting to me, as it's way out of the realm of Ono's usual work. Continuing with the audio department, the show's sound design, headed by Toru Nakano, is very hit or miss. For every punchy, mechanical sound effect, there's the most flaccid sounding gunshot I've heard in a long time right next to it. Thankfully, where it counts, the sounds that all the Getter units themselves make are fantastic, perfectly crunchy and menacing, instilling a good sense of heft to the show's robots. Shiho Terada and Yoshichika Kuriyama's soundtrack certainly does its job well enough, but unfortunately, aside from the banger Jam Project performed opening theme Bloodlines and the final episode's track Comrades, nothing from it sticks out as hard as any of the music in the previous Kawagoe directed Getter anime. They did a good job, that's for sure, but the only truly memorable tracks are their fantastic work on the show's Jam Project performed music. The best actual tracks used in the show itself are some of Kazuo Nobuta's reused music from Shin vs. Neo. And now that I've covered the narrative and audio strengths of the show, well, it's time to address what's easily the show's biggest flaw, and the place I feel makes this adaptation a real shame but also a small miracle. The presentation. Getter Robo Arc is ugly. And I mean legit ugly. Not intentionally off-kilter like some series, actually ugly. And I mean that in the "this series did not get the funding or production schedule it needed" kind of way. Jun Kawagoe is an excellent director. That cannot be argued, and some episodes of Arc do have some real exceptional directing present. But even with his usual strengths, and with the staff that covered the 2D animation consisting mostly of longtime Kawagoe collaborators, you can really tell the series was just not given much to work with outside of what Bandai provided. That's not to say every single frame of the show or even episodes look bad. Episode 7, for example, is carried by some particularly strong directing and lighting, with some exceptional striking shots. And episode 11 and 13 look pretty fantastic all around, with moments that serve as the animation highlights of the show. But even with this brief, massive uptick in quality, it's hard not to see that the series is shaky at best on a technical level. And it's so stiff overall that you'd think the show had arthritis. The series ends up finding an over-reliance on still shots. And while some of these still shots look good, a lot of them just look messy. This face that Takuma makes in the first episode summarizes that. A lot of the full screen-filling shots in the show are just bad. Where the previous Getter OVAs would reference the manga by calling back to the composition of certain panels, Getter Robo Arc just uses said panels, and colors them over with an awkward filter. Seeing exact pages from the manga is pretty cool, but when they're edited in a way that feels like you threw it into Adobe After Effects and messed around for 2 minutes, I can't help but feel underwhelmed. Some otherwise really potentially impactful scenes end up feeling lackluster. And it's just kind of annoying that nothing interesting was done with the usage of these manga panels. Though sometimes the show does go out of its way to recreate panels in its own style, and they often look far worse than they did in the manga. So it creates this weird issue where on one hand you have stiff, barely moving manga panels, or you just have a really bad recreation of one of the shots. Thankfully, the actual character design, done by Hideyuki Motohashi, is really strong. Motohashi has previously worked with Ken Ishikawa characters before. He was the character designer on the Kyomu Senshi Miraku OVA as well. And his designs for all of the characters in Getter Arc are very accurate to Ishikawa's art style. In fact, I'd say in terms of pure design, this is the closest the characters have ever looked to their actual Ishikawa iterations. Sadly, those character designs are slightly let down by the show's overall art direction. Headed by Daisuke Negishi, it tries its hardest to look exactly like the manga, but with the overall stiffness of the show and the weird janky direction in places, the art direction overall suffers from feeling really flat in places. And we definitely can't pin this on one person. It's no one individual's fault when a big project like this has major flaws. These character and environment designs are really complex, and they are hard to animate, and the anime industry is just in a different place than it was when the last 3 OVAs were produced. B Media is a pretty small, inactive studio. They pretty much only work on Jun Kawagoe directed shows, which have become less and less frequent the older he's gotten. And when it comes to getting new animators, that's just difficult nowadays. With a lot of studios exploiting young talent and treating a series production like an assembly line, the environment that cultivated the previous 3 OVAs just doesn't exist anymore. Again, this is a TV production. It's not even an OVA like the previous Kawagoe shows. And while it may sound like I'm making up excuses for the show's shortcomings, I'm really not. I had a feeling the show would always be janky. I mean, the earliest trailers for the show made that more than apparent. It's just the level of jank we got is a little more than I expected, which left me wondering how much support this team actually got. In certain segments, the major fights and flashbacks in particular, you can really see the effort they put into doing justice to Ishikawa's manga. I would never call the show lazy, but its 2D aspects are definitely messy, even if the passion that the entire staff has for the series is very clear. But on the other hand, while the 2D animation in the show is a major issue, the CG handled by Next Animation Studio Limited and Studio ACAT is rough in places, sure, but overall is pretty good. This is one of those situations where I was really happy to see the CG models show up in any scene they did, which thankfully is 90% of the fight scenes in the show. The models move well, they animate with a good level of weight, their presence feels tangible and not slapdash, and the quality of most of the models is pretty high, though some are definitely not as refined as others. A majority of the enemies from the Andromeda country and all of the Getter units look really good though, and that makes up for a majority of the models in the show. I've never been that against CG animation in mecha anime. Like I said a few minutes ago, the industry's just not in the same place it was when mecha anime was all 2D, but it's far harder for a production to get going on one. Mecha are hard to illustrate, mecha are even harder to animate, so of course CG mechs are a necessary crutch for shows to lean on. Of course this is a little disappointing, but it's unfortunately the reality right now. Studio ACAT does not have the best track record, so I'm really happy with how their CG work in the series came out. Sure, it's not quite as refined as, say, Graphinica's work on Dynazenon earlier this year, but the CG is still cleaner than a handful of shows in the last few years. And when it comes to mechanical design, the trio of Goichi Iwata, Noritaka Suzuki, and Yasuhiro Moroki knocked it out of the park. Their slightly revised versions of these machines do an excellent job representing some of the most detailed designs from Ishikawa's manga. And this is in spite of the fact that the series' unfortunately flat lighting leads to Getter Arc looking quite a bit less terrifying than it does in the manga. Once again, despite all of the show's technical issues, the writing and acting is still top-notch here, and still in my opinion very worthy of Getter Robo's legacy. It's just a shame that a lot of outside factors led to the presentation not being able to keep up. New Getter Robo was also certainly a rough show, but its OVA production schedule and its excellent directing and artwork carried the weight that the actual animation may have lacked. Getter Robo Arc unfortunately didn't have that luxury, but even so you can still tell how much Jun Kawagoe and his staff love Getter Robo. This show ended up working entirely off the fuel of the staff's passion, and nothing really reflects this more to me than the show's one major narrative change and its anime original ending. The following section is going to be very spoiler heavy. I'm going to discuss the ending and major change in detail, so please skip here if you just want to see the outro. Okay, is everybody gone from the review part? Alright, good. I'm gonna go off script for this. So how about the inclusion of Go and Black Shin Getter? This is one of the sickest ways of tying the series back into Getter Robo Go in my opinion. A projection of Go sent back into the past by the will of Getter to fight on the side of the Saotome Institute is such a good idea, and perfectly fits in with the time travel elements of the story. It also gives Go one final proper goodbye to the world of Getter Robo. Yes, it does have an air of I clapped when I saw it, but between Black Shin Getter's excellent design, and some pretty sick, very well directed sequences for it to take part in, as well as a genuinely heartfelt send-off to Go's character, This anime addition to Getter Robo Arc's story felt pretty natural. It wasn't shoehorned at all, and it seamlessly integrated into the addition of Getter Robo Go characters onto the cast. The moment Sho Tachibana became a member of the anime's cast, I knew Go would appear in some serious capacity. In spite of his fitting but relatively short screen time, I was definitely not let down by the way the show handled him. Throughout the series' run, I was repeatedly pointing out that by the time we hit the 11th episode, an entirely anime original ending would start to unravel, and I was pretty accurate with that prediction. I know this ending has been somewhat divisive for some people, but I'm going to explain my personal reasons for why I love it. Most of Ken Ishikawa's manga do not have full narrative bookends. They have thematic bookends. And that right there is what Getter Robo Arc as an anime runs with. The first step the show takes to achieving this is how Hayato's character arc from the manga is concluded. Picking up exactly from where he left off in the manga, the anime sees the old, passionate Hayato return for one last brawl. And it's the best animated fight in the show on top of that, while also using this one last hurrah to really push home the message of Getter Robo Arc. That the future is not set in stone, and the actions that we take can in fact have a massive cascading effect. Hayato finally gets to literally and figuratively pass the torch to the next generation in this new sequence, leaving Takuma, Kamui, and Baku to find their own future. And we get to fully see each of them go about this in a different way. Baku choosing to stay with the Getter Emperor as he believes that the Getter Rays are not inherently evil and are subject to change based on the events of history perfectly ties back to his role as the heart in that body-brain-heart dynamic I discussed in my original retrospective. We've seen many characters assimilate themselves with the Getter Rays, but up to this point we hadn't really had a character who sets out to understand what the Getter Rays are on a fundamental level. Baku being the character to take that step is honestly pretty perfect in my opinion. In terms of Kamui's conclusion, we finally get to see the consequences of his actions, as his takeover of the Dinosaur Empire and construction of Bug immediately begins to drag his life into hell by the second, causing him to lose pretty much everything he holds dear. But he remains dead set in his ways, believing that destroying the human world now will prevent any kind of apocalyptic Getter-controlled future. This perfectly fills in the blank space between the manga's final chapter and the series' final few pages, showing us just how the characters got to this point, and really reinforcing Kamui's conviction, while also finding a way to criticize the character's actions without demonizing him. Kamui is not Getter Robo Arc's villain, and the show's finale goes out of its way to reinforce that. Getting to see the actual battle between Kamui and Takuma is immensely satisfying, as the two clash one final time, battling over the idea that the future can be salvaged to begin with, and right as that same image that the manga concluded on shows up, the credits hit. And I laughed harder than I think I've ever laughed at the end of any anime. I knew there would be more as there was still about 5 minutes left in the episode, but doing a fake out end credit sequence ending right where the manga does is hilarious, and was the exact kind of wink and nod to the audience that I love. All set to a genuinely heartfelt montage paying tribute to Hayato's full story, before the post-credit scene hits and finally concludes the story of Getter Robo in a way I find satisfying. When I said Getter Robo's manga was unfinished, I meant that in a thematic sense. Like I said, Ishikawa's manga never had narrative endings. They had thematic endings. The actual events of the story in his manga would never conclude, as pretty much all of his stories would end with a thematically appropriate pseudo-cliffhanger that put a satisfying capstone on the story's central concepts. But due to Ishikawa's tragic passing, Getter Robo Arc never got to get that pseudo-cliffhanger capstone. It had an actual cliffhanger instead, which is why I think this post-credit scene is perfect. It shows that the Arc team's battle is not over, but it leaves the story on an optimistic note that reinforces the idea that the future can be changed, and that it's not set in stone. The fear and the darkness that the Getter Rays can come to represent don't have to be the future. Getter Robo as a series has always been about camaraderie and overcoming darkness together. Despite some of the vile events that conspire, it's always been an optimistic series, about humanity's potential as a collective force. The manga's initial cliffhanger was unfortunate because Ishikawa never got to nail this point home one last time. The post-credit scene that this anime adds finally brings what I personally always pictured the ending of the series being to fruition. The fight will always continue. The Getter team's battle will never end. The entirety of the manga and almost every adaptation has just reinforced this. But the glimmer of hope, the potential for a better future, is always there. We don't know what the future entails, but we can certainly try our hardest to make it a good one. Getter Robo Arc is a very messy and flawed show, but at the same time it perfectly understands Getter Robo as a franchise, and still ended up being an immensely satisfying watch to me. Out of all the TV Getter anime, this is definitely my favorite, even if I'd say that the Toei shows are far better on a technical level. Getter Robo Arc is a 9 out of 10 show trapped in a 5 out of 10 production, and when you finally Getter change those numbers together, I've gotta call this show the greatest 7 out of 10 of all time. It's a massively flawed series, but one that found a way to satisfy me in a way I could have never imagined, and honestly, that means a lot to me. It's flawed, but at the end of the day, it's still immensely passionate, and proof that Kawagoe still has a perfect understanding of what this series is all about. And to send this video off, I'll let Takuma reinforce the point one last time.
過去も未来もクソくらいだ。未来は俺たちの未来は俺たちの手で作るんだ。チェンジゲッター。
Also, the dub is pretty good.
Let's go find some Dino China.